He didn't raise his voice. That's the part that still echoes in my mind more than anything else. No shouting, no anger, no dramatic words thrown across the room. Just silence, and then his eyes meeting mine, steady and cold, like he had already made peace with the decision long before I ever knew it was coming. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him. The television was on, but the sound suddenly felt too loud, like it didn't belong in that room anymore. He reached for the remote, pressed a button, and the screen went dark. The sudden quiet was heavy, almost suffocating. I remember noticing the ticking of the clock on the wall, each second passing like it was counting down something I couldn't see. Then he said it. Leave. Just one word. No explanation, no argument, no emotion. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a decision that had already been finalized in his mind. The kind of decision that doesn't need justification because in that moment, the other person's feelings no longer matter. I stood there, frozen. My mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. 1,000 questions rushed through my head at once. Why? What did I do? Where am I supposed to go? But none of them made it past my lips. It was like my voice had abandoned me the same way the room suddenly felt like it had. He didn't look angry. That scared me more than if he had shouted. Anger would have meant emotion. Anger would have meant I still mattered enough to cause a reaction. But this was calm, controlled, final. I searched his face for something, anything that suggested this was a joke, a test, or even a moment of frustration that would pass. But there was nothing, just patience, as if he was waiting for me to accept reality and move on. Please, I almost said, but I didn't. Not because I was strong, not because I was proud, but because something inside me knew that begging wouldn't change a thing. Whatever decision had been made, it wasn't made in that moment. I was simply being informed. I looked around the room one last time. The couch where I had sat so many nights, convincing myself that things would get better. The small table with a cup I had forgotten to wash. The door that suddenly felt farther away than it ever had before. Everything looked the same, yet nothing belonged to me anymore. He turned away before I could say anything else. That was it. No goodbye, no final words, just an ending that arrived without warning. As I stepped toward the door, my hands were shaking. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, loud and uneven. Each step felt heavier than the last, like my body was resisting what my mind still couldn't fully accept. I didn't know then that this moment, this quiet dismissal, this silent walk toward the exit would become the starting point of something entirely different. At the time, all I knew was that I was being asked to disappear, to walk away without a word. And I did. What I couldn't possibly know in that moment was this. Walking away would lead me to someone I wasn't looking for, someone I didn't expect, someone who would change the direction of my life in ways I couldn't imagine. But that night, as the door closed behind me, all I felt was the weight of rejection pressing down on my chest. I had no idea that this ending was actually the beginning. Before that night, before the silence, before the word leave changed the shape of my life, I was someone who believed I knew where I belonged. I wasn't rich, I wasn't powerful, I didn't have everything figured out, but I had something that felt just as important at the time: stability, or at least the illusion of it. Financially, I was just getting by. Every month was a careful calculation: rent, food, bills, small responsibilities that added up faster than I could manage. I didn't live with luxury, but I lived with hope. I told myself that struggle was temporary, that if I just kept pushing a little longer, things would eventually fall into place. I believed hard work would protect me. I believed loyalty would be returned. Emotionally, I was tired. Not the kind of tired sleep can fix, but the deep exhaustion that comes from constantly trying to be enough. I carried worries quietly, never wanting to be a burden. I smiled when I needed to. I stayed silent when things hurt. I learned to shrink my needs so others could be comfortable. And the people I was living with, they weren't strangers. That's what made it hurt the most. They were people I trusted, people I defended when others questioned them, people I made excuses for when things didn't feel right. I believed in them, even when I doubted myself. I thought we were connected by something stronger than convenience, by respect, understanding, maybe even love in its own imperfect form. I remember telling myself, this is my safe place. A place where I didn't have to constantly look over my shoulder, a place where I could rest, even if just a little. I wasn't asking for much, just room to breathe, to rebuild, to feel like I was completely alone in the world. I gave them my trust without conditions. I shared my fears, my plans, my weaknesses. I let my guard down in ways I rarely did with anyone else. In my mind, that meant something. It had to mean something. But slowly, so slowly that I didn't notice at first, things began to change. Conversations became shorter, smiles felt forced, the warmth that once existed was replaced by politeness. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself everyone goes through phases. I didn't want to accept the idea that I might no longer be welcome. Because if this wasn't my safe place, then where was? I kept giving, kept adjusting, kept telling myself that loyalty meant staying even when things felt uncomfortable. I believed patience would fix what honesty might break. Looking back now, I realize how much of myself I was sacrificing just to belong. I wasn't perfect, I made mistakes, I had flaws, but I was genuine, I was loyal, and I truly believed that counted for something. I trusted them. I thought this was my safe place. I didn't know then that safety built on silence is fragile, and I didn't realize how quickly it could disappear without warning, without explanation, and without mercy. At the time, though, I was still holding on to hope, holding on to trust, holding on to a place I thought would never ask me to leave. Looking back now, the signs were there. Not loud, not obvious, just quiet shifts, small enough to ignore, easy enough to explain away if you didn't want to believe what they were really saying. At first, it was the silence. Not the comfortable kind that exists between people who understand each other, but the awkward kind, the kind that stretches too long, the kind that makes you wonder if you've said something wrong, even when you haven't said anything at all. Conversations became shorter, replies came slower, questions that once mattered were met with one-word answers. I would speak, and it felt like my words were landing in empty space, never really reaching anyone. Then came the cold behavior. No direct conflict, no arguments, just distance. They stopped looking at me the way they used to. Eye contact felt forced, smiles didn't reach their eyes. It was as if a wall had been quietly built overnight without my permission. I remember walking into the room and feeling like I didn't belong there anymore. Not because anyone said it yet, but because the energy had changed. The air felt heavier. My presence felt inconvenient. I started noticing how conversation stopped when I entered, only to resume in whispers when I left. I told myself I was overthinking it. I had to be, because accepting the truth meant accepting something I wasn't ready for, that I was slowly being pushed out of a place I still called home. Their attitudes changed in subtle ways. Small comments, passive remarks, jokes that carried hidden meaning. Every now and then I would catch a look that said, "We're tired of this," though I wasn't sure what this even was. And still, no one talked to me. That was the hardest part. If they had yelled, I could have defended myself. If they had accused, I could have explained. But silence leaves you nowhere to stand. Silence makes you question yourself. Silence convinces you that maybe you deserve what's coming. I started walking on eggshells, careful with my words, careful with my movements, careful with my emotions. I tried to take up less space, make less noise, exist without being noticed. I thought if I became invisible enough, maybe I could stay. Late at night, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations in my head. Did I say something wrong? Did I do something they didn't like? When did everything feel so off? There were moments when I almost asked, almost, but something stopped me every time, a quiet fear that asking the question would force an answer I wasn't ready for. So instead, I stayed silent, hoping the tension would fade on its own. It didn't. Each day felt like waiting for something inevitable, like standing under a darkening sky, knowing a storm was coming, but pretending the clouds would pass. The house no longer felt warm. It felt temporary, like I was a guest who had overstayed their welcome without realizing it. And deep down, beneath all the denial and hope, there was a voice whispering the truth. Something I just didn't know when. It happened in the early evening, that quiet hour when the day is technically still alive, but everything feels like it's slowing down. The light outside was fading, slipping through the window in soft, tired shades of orange and gray. The room wasn't dark yet, but it wasn't bright either. It felt like the world itself was unsure of what it was about to witness. I remember standing there, unsure why I had been asked to stay in the room. No one sat down. No one offered me a place to sit. That alone should have told me something. Their faces were calm, almost rehearsed, not angry, not emotional, just resolved. That's when I knew. The silence was heavy, thick. It pressed against my chest until breathing felt unnatural. No one spoke at first. They looked at each other briefly, then back at me. That look, quiet agreement, hurt more than any words ever could. Then one of them finally spoke. "You should leave. No arguments, no explanations." The words didn't register immediately. They just hung there in the air, flat and final, like they had been placed carefully to avoid any emotional reaction. I blinked. Once, twice, trying to process what I had just heard. My mind searched for meaning beyond the words, some hidden message, some chance to respond. There was none. I felt heat rush to my face. Shock came first, pure, disorienting shock, the kind that makes your body freeze while your thoughts race in every direction at once. I felt exposed, like I had been stripped of dignity in a single sentence. My heart pounded, but everything else went numb. Then came embarrassment, not loud, not dramatic, quiet and crushing. I became suddenly aware of myself, of where I was standing, of how small I must have looked in that moment. I wondered if they felt relief saying it. I wondered if they had practiced those words before I ever entered the room. I looked at their faces, hoping, stupidly, for hesitation. There was none. No guilt, no regret, just expectation, as if the conversation was already over and I was the only one who hadn't caught up yet. My lips parted, but nothing came out. Not because I didn't have something to say, but because the words felt pointless. What do you say when you're dismissed like a problem someone finally decided to solve? I felt myself shut down, emotionally numb, detached, like I was watching the moment happen to someone else. My hands felt cold. My body felt light, almost unreal. The room seemed too quiet, too still, as if even the walls were listening. No one moved. They waited. That was when I understood something painful and clear. They weren't asking me to leave. They were done with me. No discussion, no closure, no dignity. Just an ending. I nodded slowly, not trusting my voice. Turning away felt easier than letting them see what was happening inside me. As I took my first step out of the room, I realized this wasn't just rejection. This was the moment that broke me. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. There were so many things I wanted to say. The words were right there, crowded in my chest, pressing against my throat, begging to be released. Questions, defenses I didn't even know I owed. A part of me wanted to turn around, to ask why, to remind them of everything I had given, everything I had endured in silence. But I didn't. I chose silence, not because it was easy, but because speaking felt useless. Their faces had already closed the door before my body ever reached it. I could feel it. Anything I said would only echo back empty, unheard, unwanted. So I swallowed the words. Each one felt heavy going down, like I was burying pieces of myself just to keep walking. I went to the room where my things were. It didn't feel like my room anymore. It felt borrowed, temporary, like I had been living on borrowed time without realizing it. I stood there for a moment, unsure where to begin. Everything suddenly felt meaningless. Clothes, books, small personal items that once gave me comfort. I packed slowly, not because I had a lot, but because each item carried a memory, a moment when I thought I belonged, a reminder of how safe I once believed I was. I folded my clothes carefully, not wanting to make noise, not wanting to draw attention, like I was afraid even my movements might annoy someone. My hands were steady, but my mind wasn't. How did it come to this? When did I stop being welcome? Did I ever really belong here at all? No one checked on me. No one asked if I needed help. No one asked where I would go. That silence hurt more than the words that had already been spoken. It confirmed what I was trying not to accept. I had already been erased from their concern. When the bag was finally zipped, it felt heavier than it should have, not because of what was inside, but because of what I was leaving behind. I took one last look around the room. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I walked toward the door quietly. Each step felt unreal, like I was floating through a moment I wasn't fully allowed to feel yet. My heart was beating fast, but my face stayed blank. I didn't want them to see anything. I didn't want them to give them the satisfaction of knowing how deeply this hurt. As I reached the door, I paused, just for a second. I wondered if someone would stop me, call my name, say they had changed their mind, say this was a mistake. No one did. I opened the door and stepped outside. The air felt different, colder, sharper. The sound of the door closing behind me was soft, almost gentle, but to me it sounded final, like a chapter being shut without my permission. And suddenly I felt invisible, not just unwanted, but unseen. People passed by, cars moved, life continued as if nothing significant had just happened. And maybe to everyone else, nothing had. But for me, everything had collapsed into that single moment. I stood there, holding my bag, with nowhere to go and no plan to follow. Loneliness wrapped around me quickly, not the dramatic kind, the quiet, sinking kind, the kind that settles in your chest and makes you realize how alone you truly are. I didn't know where I would sleep. I didn't know who I could call. I didn't even know what I would do next. All I knew was that I had walked away without a word, and now I was standing at the edge of an uncertain future, carrying my life in a single bag, wondering how someone could be surrounded by the world and still feel completely alone. I didn't go anywhere meaningful, that's the truth. I just walked, down streets I didn't recognize, past lights that felt too bright for how dark everything inside me had become. I let my feet decide the direction because my mind was too exhausted to make choices. Every step felt automatic, like my body was moving while my soul lagged behind, still standing in that room I had been asked to leave. At some point, I found myself sitting on a bench. I don't remember choosing it. I don't remember noticing it until I was already there. The sky had darkened completely by then, and the air, that late night quiet where everything feels distant and unreal. Cars passed occasionally, their headlights sweeping over me for just a second, long enough to remind me I still existed, not long enough to make me feel seen. I sat there with my bag at my feet, staring at nothing. My thoughts were loud, too loud. They came in waves, one after another, never giving me time to breathe. I replayed the moment again and again, as if watching it from different angles might somehow change the outcome. The silence from earlier followed me. It clung to me. I wondered what they were doing now. Had they already moved on? Were they relieved? Or had I never mattered enough for my absence to be noticed at all? That's when the questions turned inward. Was I worthless? The word felt harsh, but it wouldn't leave my mind. I thought about everything I had tried to be, helpful, loyal, patient. I thought about all the times I had stayed quiet to keep peace, and still I had been discarded so easily, like something broken, like something unnecessary. Was this my fault? I searched my memory desperately, looking for mistakes big enough to justify what had happened. I blamed myself for things I couldn't control. I blamed myself for not speaking sooner, for trusting too easily, for believing I belonged somewhere simply because I was told I did. Time moved strangely. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like nothing at all. I checked my phone, but there were no messages, no missed calls, no signs that anyone was looking for me or wondering where I had gone. That hurt more than I expected. I leaned back against the bench and closed my eyes, hoping the night air would calm my thoughts. Instead, it made everything feel sharper. The loneliness settled deeper, heavier, like it was carving out a permanent space inside me. I thought about my future, or rather, the sudden lack of one. Where would I sleep? What would I do tomorrow? How do you rebuild your life when it feels like your foundation has been pulled out from under you without warning? I realized how fragile everything was, how quickly stability can vanish, how easily people can change their minds about you, how one sentence can erase years of effort and trust. There were moments when I felt completely empty. No anger, no sadness, just a hollow space where hope used to live. Other moments, the pain rushed back all at once, tight and overwhelming, making it hard to breathe. I sat there until the night grew colder, until the streets became quieter, until I could no longer tell if the tears on my face were from crying or from the cold air brushing against my skin. I didn't have answers. I didn't have direction. All I had were questions echoing in my mind and the heavy realization that for the first time in a long while, I was completely on my own. And in those long, empty hours after leaving, I began to understand just how alone a person can feel, even in a world full of people. I didn't expect anyone to notice me. Not at the bus stop, not at the small cafe I wandered into just to escape the night air, not on the park bench where I finally sat, exhausted and numb. I felt invisible, like the world had folded over me and forgotten I existed. And in truth, I think that's exactly how I wanted it. That's when they appeared. At first, they didn't seem important at all, just another face in the crowd, a stranger with an overcoat slightly too large, a cup of coffee in one hand, a book in the other. They looked calm, ordinary, the kind of person you pass every day without noticing. I tried not to look. I had no energy for interaction, no desire for conversation. But somehow they noticed me. Not in a dramatic way, not like a scene out of a movie, just quietly, almost casually. They smiled, small, unassuming, and asked if the seat next to me was taken. I didn't answer at first. My instincts said keep quiet, keep moving, keep existing in the shadows. But before I could shift away, they sat down anyway. I felt awkward, vulnerable, exposed, and yet strangely curious. "You look like you've had a long day," they said softly, not in a prying way, not in a condescending way, just observation. I shrugged. No words. They didn't push. They just nodded and took a sip of their coffee. Then, after a pause that felt longer than it should have, they asked again, "Do you want to talk?" I didn't know why they started talking to me. I had no idea why someone I had never met seemed to care even a little. And yet I found myself glancing at them, intrigued despite myself. Something in their presence felt safe, not loud, not overwhelming, just quiet and steady, like they weren't trying to fix me, they weren't judging me. They simply existed in a way that made it okay for me to exist too. For the first time that night, I considered the possibility that I wasn't entirely invisible. I didn't speak immediately. I wasn't ready, but I stayed, just a little longer. And in that small pause, I realized something. This encounter wasn't just random. Something about it felt different, important. I still didn't know how or why. I only knew that somehow this stranger had managed to reach a part of me I thought had disappeared forever. And that was the beginning. The beginning of something I didn't yet understand, but something I desperately needed. We didn't start with anything dramatic. No life-changing declarations, no probing questions, just small talk. "Cold night," they said, their voice soft, almost casual. "Yeah," I mumbled, staring at my hands resting on my bag. The words felt heavy, weighed down by everything that had happened just hours ago. They didn't push. They didn't ask why I looked so lost. They just nodded and sipped their coffee. There was a patience in them, quiet but firm, that made it okay for me to exist without having to explain myself. For a while, we sat in silence. The kind of silence that isn't uncomfortable, not exactly peaceful either, just neutral, observing, accepting. And then they asked it, "You know, why do you think you're here on this bench alone?" I blinked, caught off guard. It wasn't accusatory, it wasn't judgmental, it was simply curious. I didn't answer at first. How could I? The last few hours had felt like a storm tearing me apart piece by piece. How could I put that into words? They waited, patiently, calmly. Finally, I whispered, I was asked to leave." They nodded as if this explained everything, and yet nothing at all. Then came the line I didn't expect, the one that hit harder than anything anyone had said to me all night. "Sometimes being asked to leave is life making space for something better." The words landed slowly. At first, I resisted them. I wanted to argue, to tell them that wasn't true, that life had no right to ask me to leave like that some spaces, some people are supposed to be safe. But the more I sat there, the more I realized maybe it was true. I'd spent so long believing that leaving meant failure, that being asked to walk away was the end of the road. But what if it wasn't the end at all? What if it was a beginning disguised as an ending? I found myself looking at them, really looking for the first time that night. Their presence was simple yet grounding. Their eyes weren't full of pity. They weren't searching for a story to exploit. They were just there, offering a perspective I hadn't considered, that sometimes loss isn't punishment, it's preparation. I felt something inside me shift. Not completely, not all at once, but just enough to feel lighter. It wasn't magic, it wasn't an instant fix, but it was enough to plant a seed of hope in a heart that had been convinced hope no longer existed. For the first time that night, I began to imagine that maybe I could survive this. Maybe I could even move forward. All because of a simple conversation and a stranger who didn't have to care, but did anyway. After that night on the park bench, something inside me began to shift. The stranger didn't lecture me. They didn't give me advice I wasn't ready to hear. They didn't tell me what to do or where to go. Instead, they asked questions, small, gentle questions that made me think, made me reflect. made me consider the possibility that I had value beyond the walls I had just left behind. "Do you know your worth?" they asked one evening as we sat across from each other in the same quiet cafe. I paused, caught off guard. I didn't even know how to answer. For so long, I had believed that my worth was defined by what others allowed me to keep, by how long I could endure, by whether or not I was wanted. And now I had been told I didn't belong. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. They smiled, softly, without judgment. "You do. You just forgot, and sometimes we need someone else to remind us until we remember for ourselves." That simple statement, so quiet, so unassuming, planted a tiny spark, a spark that had long been buried beneath fear, rejection, and silence. Over the next days, our conversations continued, not forced, not hurried, but steady, persistent, like a gentle tide washing over the rough edges of my pain. They encouraged me to speak, not to defend myself, not to justify my existence, but to simply express myself. "Say it," they would say. "What's in your heart? What's in your mind? You don't need permission." And I began to. At first, it was awkward. My voice felt foreign, like a muscle I hadn't used in years. The words trembled as they came out. But each time I spoke, it became a little easier. Each time, the fear of judgment or rejection lost a bit of its grip. I learned to value my own voice again, to trust it, to let it matter. We spoke about hope, about courage, about the possibility of moving forward despite everything. And slowly, I began to feel a shift inside me. The heaviness that had weighed down every step, every breath, every thought began to lift, just a little. I realized that silence had kept me safe in some ways. It had protected me from pain, from confrontation, from embarrassment. But it had also kept me small, invisible, afraid. Now speaking, even a little, felt like reclaiming myself. The stranger didn't rescue me. They didn't magically erase the hurt or the fear, but they reminded me that my voice mattered, that my story mattered, that I had the power to exist fully without waiting for someone else's approval. And in that realization, I felt the first glimmer of emotional healing. The silence that had once suffocated me became a contrast, a shadow against which I could now hear my own words, strong and steady, slowly filling the emptiness. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt alive again. Not because everything had changed, but because I had started to speak. The days after that first conversation with the stranger didn't feel miraculous. There were no instant solutions, no dramatic transformations. Life still carried its weight, still felt uncertain, still pressed down with the memories of rejection. But something inside me had shifted ever so slightly. I noticed it in small ways at first. The way I stood taller when I walked down the street, even if only by an inch. The way I spoke when ordering coffee without apologizing for my presence. The way I allowed myself to pause in conversations, to actually express a thought without fear of judgment. These were tiny, almost invisible acts, but each one felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that I hadn't realized I had lost. I started thinking differently, not in loud, overwhelming epiphanies, but in quiet, deliberate ways. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" I began asking, "What can I do now?" The questions were subtle, but the shift in focus was profound. It wasn't about blaming or analyzing the past. It was about exploring what I could create moving forward. I began small projects, nothing grand, nothing that would change my life overnight. Writing a few lines in a notebook each day, taking short walks instead of staying cooped up, reaching out to one friend I had been avoiding because of shame or embarrassment, These little actions didn't solve everything, but they reminded me that I still had agency, that my choices, however tiny, mattered. One morning, I caught myself smiling for no reason at all. It was a simple, fleeting smile, but it felt heavier with meaning than anything I had felt in weeks. I realized I was starting to hope again. Not the naive hope that everything would magically be perfect, but the quiet, resilient hope that things could slowly get better, and that I had a role to play in making them better. Growth, I discovered, didn't announce itself. It didn't demand attention. It arrived as a whisper, a slightly steadier step, a calmer breath, a voice that didn't tremble as much when it spoke. And yet, it was enough. Enough to remind me that even after being asked to leave, even after feeling invisible, even after hours of loneliness and despair, there was still something to hold on to. A spark of self-worth, a sense of possibility, a first sign that I could rebuild myself piece by piece. Life was still uncertain, the future was still unclear, but for the first time in a long while, I felt capable of moving forward. Not running, not pretending, just moving, slowly, steadily, purposefully. That meeting with a stranger hadn't fixed everything, but it had planted a seed. And over the days and weeks that followed, I began to see it sprout. It took time before I was ready, not just to forgive them or even to confront them, but to stand in the same space where I had once felt so small and unwelcome and feel nothing that would break me. When I finally returned, I didn't walk in with anger or a desire for revenge. There were no harsh words trembling on my lips, no need to explain myself or prove anything. I didn't seek acknowledgement. I didn't need permission to exist. I walked in quietly, but with my head held high. The place looked the same, but I didn't. The walls didn't carry the same weight over my shoulders. The silence didn't press down like it had before. And the people, the ones who had told me to leave so quietly, so confidently, as if my presence no longer mattered, looked at me as if they were seeing me for the first time. I felt a strange calmness, not pride, not arrogance, just clarity. I was no longer defined by their opinions, their approval, or their decisions. I had lived through rejection and walked away. I had carried loneliness and uncertainty, and now I'd found my voice again, my worth, my ability to stand tall. I spoke when I needed to, quietly, firmly, without hesitation. My words carried the weight of someone who had survived, someone who had learned their own worth, someone who no longer needed validation from the people who had once tried to erase them. I didn't beg, I didn't explain. I simply existed in my own right, and that presence was enough. They noticed the change, though I didn't seek it, the way I held myself, the steadiness of my voice, the confidence in my eyes. It said everything I couldn't have said back then. Facing them wasn't about confrontation. It wasn't about proving who was right or wrong. It was about witnessing my own growth reflected in the space that had once made me feel so small. I realized then that true strength isn't loud. It doesn't demand recognition. It's quiet. It's resilience. It's walking into a place that once broke you and leaving it knowing you are no longer the same person who could be broken there. For the first time, I felt free in that room. Free from fear, free from doubt, free from the chains of someone else's judgment. I had faced the past, and I was stronger for it. And I knew, finally, that I could face anything that came next. It wasn't immediate, not at first, but over time, cracks began to appear in the facade they had carefully maintained, the same people who had told me to leave so quietly, so confidently, as if my presence no longer mattered. I began to hear whispers, small admissions, things that hadn't been said before. At first, I ignored them. I didn't want to believe that after everything they were reconsidering, realizing, regretting. My heart was too tender for hope to come so easily. But then came the moments I couldn't ignore. A comment from someone who had witnessed our interactions, a quiet acknowledgement that my absence had left a gap they hadn't anticipated, a hesitant apology for words left unsaid, for actions that had hurt more than they intended, or perhaps more than they realized. And then the truth came out, fully. They admitted it, not all at once and not in a way that demanded I forgive them, but slowly, carefully, the words spilled. "You didn't deserve that," one of them said, voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't realize how much you gave, how much you mattered until it was gone." It was a strange, almost surreal moment. I had spent so long carrying the weight of rejection, replaying the humiliation, questioning my worth. And here they were, acknowledging it. Regret, hidden truths, a recognition of value I had always known for myself but had been denied by their actions. For a long time, I said nothing. Not because I was angry, not because I wanted revenge, but because I had already learned that my validation didn't need to come from them. I had survived, I had grown, I had found strength I didn't know existed. Yet hearing the truth, it hit differently. It wasn't just about what they said, it was about what I had endured and how their realization now confirmed something I already knew. My worth had never been diminished, not really. Their rejection had been their limitation, not mine. There was a profound silence after the confession, a pause heavy with things left unsaid, a recognition that time had passed, wounds had begun to heal, and life had continued despite their choices. I could see the weight of regret in their eyes, the realization that they had underestimated me. But I no longer needed them to see me. Their acknowledgement was not a request. Their acknowledgement was not a request for forgiveness, but a mirror showing how far I had come. And in that moment, I felt a profound sense of closure. The truth had been revealed, not in anger, not in vindication, but in the quiet recognition that my presence, my efforts, my loyalty, and my heart had always held value, even when they failed to see it. I didn't celebrate their regret, I simply accepted it as part of the journey, a final confirmation that I had grown beyond their limitations. The past had spoken its truth. And now I could move forward, fully aware of my worth, unshaken by anyone else's inability to recognize it. I never learned their name, not in the usual sense anyway. After that first night on the park bench, our encounters became sporadic. Sometimes they appeared in cafes I wandered into, sometimes at bus stops where I waited in silence. Occasionally, they left notes, small scraps of paper folded carefully, written in that same calm, steady hand, reminding me of the things I had begun to forget, my worth, my courage, my ability to move forward. And then they disappeared. No dramatic farewell, no final revelation, just absence. One day, I went looking for them and found nothing, no trace, no sign, not even a hint that they had ever been there. It was as if they had existed solely to guide me until I could stand on my own. At first, I felt a pang of loss. I wanted answers. I wanted closure. I wanted to understand who had taken the time to see me when everyone else had ignored me, who had reminded me that I mattered when the world had told me otherwise. But gradually, I realized I didn't need to know. The stranger's identity was irrelevant. Their presence, their words, their patient insistence that I speak, hope, and believe again, that was what mattered. Their impact didn't vanish when they did. It stayed, quietly embedded in my thoughts, my actions, the way I now carried myself. I began to notice the lessons they had left behind. I spoke differently. I walked differently. I believed differently. Every time I hesitated, every time doubt crept in, I could hear that quiet reminder. Sometimes being asked to leave is life making space for something better. I realized then that the stranger was never about themselves. They were a catalyst, a guide, a mirror reflecting strength I had forgotten I possessed. The person they were didn't matter as much as the truth they revealed to me, that I could survive rejection, that I could reclaim my voice, and that I could find hope in the most unexpected encounters. Years later, I still think about them, sometimes in the quiet moments of early morning, sometimes in the rush of a busy street. Their words echo in my mind. I don't know where they went, if they are still guiding someone else, or if they simply exist in memory now. And maybe that's the point. Some people enter your life not to stay, but to change it forever. And though I never learned their name, I will carry the stranger's lessons with me for the rest of my life. They may have been unknown, but their impact, that was unmistakable, permanent, unforgettable. If there's one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this: silence can be strength. Walking away, stepping back, choosing not to argue or defend yourself in the face of rejection, these are not signs of weakness. They are acts of courage. They are moments where you protect your energy, honor your worth, and give yourself the space to grow beyond what others think you deserve. Rejection is not the end of your story. It can be painful, yes, crushing even, but it can also be redirection. Life has a way of closing doors that no longer serve you, often so that better opportunities, better people, and better circumstances can find their way to you. I know it doesn't feel that way in the moment. I know the loneliness, the confusion, the weight of being asked to leave can feel unbearable. I've been there. I've felt the cold bite of invisibility and the heaviness of self-doubt. But trust me when I say this: every ending that feels like a punishment may actually be a blessing in disguise. If you're being asked to walk away, trust the journey. Even if you don't understand it now, even if the path forward feels uncertain, even if you feel invisible, unheard, or unwanted, your voice, your worth, your life, they are not determined by anyone else's inability to see them. And sometimes the moments that seem like the hardest are exactly the moments that shape you, strengthen you, and prepare you for something greater than you ever imagined. So hold on to yourself, speak when you're ready, walk when you must, and never forget: the person you are becoming on the other side of rejection is stronger, wiser, and more capable than you realize. This is your story, your life, and the journey, even the painful parts, is worth every step. The night eventually gave way to morning. The sky lightened slowly, gently, as if the world itself was reminding me that even after darkness, there is always a new beginning. I sat quietly for a moment, reflecting on everything that had happened: the pain, the silence, the loneliness, and the unexpected encounters that had shifted the course of my life. I realized that life doesn't always hand you clear paths or neat endings. Sometimes it closes doors without warning, leaving you unsure where to turn. Sometimes it pushes you into moments of discomfort so that you can discover the strength, courage, and resilience you never knew you had. And sometimes those closed doors lead you to people, experiences, or lessons that change everything. I thought about the stranger, the person who had appeared without expectation, without obligation, and whose quiet guidance had reminded me of my own worth. I thought about the small choices I had made after that encounter: speaking again, walking forward, trusting myself. Each step, though hesitant at first, had led me to a place where I could see clearly, breathe freely, and believe in the possibilities ahead. Life is rarely perfect, pain is inevitable, rejection is a part of the journey, But so is growth, so is hope, and so is the quiet joy of discovering that even after being told to leave, you can find your way to a life that feels authentically yours. Sometimes the hardest endings become the most beautiful beginnings. Sometimes the loss you feel is the very thing that prepares you for a brighter, fuller path. And sometimes, just sometimes, the door that closes leads you to the person who teaches you how to open your own. And in that, I found peace.